Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm your host, Rebecca Rose. In today's episode, we will discuss highlights from the 2021 Value of Space Summit, co hosted by Aerospace and the Space ISAC. This annual event brings together experts from across the enterprise for fireside chats and panel discussions to collaborate and take action around the central theme of how space adds value to our life here on Earth. This year's theme was Securing the Value of Space, which focused on resilience, viability, and sustainability of the space economy and infrastructure. We are pleased to host Erin Miller, the Executive Director of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or Space ISAC, and Lori Gordon from the Aerospace Corporation, as they highlight key takeaways from the summit and what's next. They are talking to our own Sam Wilson. Sam, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Today's show is about the 2021 Value of Space Summit. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. Last year, I was one of the authors for a paper we published on the value of space, which helped spur the first version of this summit last year. And with me, I have two people who have helped put the event together. My very impressive colleague, Lori Gordon, and Erin Miller, who is the executive director of the Space ISAC, who, along with Aerospace, hosted the 21 Value of Space Summit. So Erin, before we jump into the summit, would you explain to the viewers what is the Space ISAC and what does it do?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Sam. Space ISAC is the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And we stood it up in 2019 when there was a public announcement from the White House for a need for public-private partnership. So this public-private partnership is intended to break down the silos of communication between the public sector and the private sector for this global space community so that we can share threats and vulnerabilities. And that includes the IC, the intelligence community, the defense community, as well as commercial sector companies and international corporations. So we're very pleased with the progress that we've made with this public-private partnership and expect that it's going to make a significant impact on the global space community's ability to do information sharing.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks so much. So both of you, and I'm going to start with Lori. Lori, having done this event now 2 years in a row, what is the biggest misconception of space and space activity that people have? What would someone watching the Value of Space Summit be most surprised by?
So there's many things, but I think one of the key things that we discussed a bit in the conference, but even more broadly, and we're writing a paper on this right now in the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, is that satellites manage about 1% of our telecom that's exchanged around the world. It's really undersea cables that are doing that. And so it's fascinating to think, I think that's sort of a big public misperception. And even in the industry, even when you ask, the space community. And so it's so critical that we figure out how to understand the interdependencies between terrestrial comms, undersea comms, and the links to satellites, because it is one big ecosystem.
Great. And Erin?
I think it's the space insurance providers section of this day one of this summit that is the most surprising to me, that there actually are space insurance providers, although there's not very many of them. And I know that Lori and I chatted about this, and she mentioned the total number. I think it was about 100, I think. You can correct me in a second here if I've got that off, but just amazing that the fact that there's not very many of them, and that they're actually encouraging that we communicate to policymakers about our dependence on space systems, and we introduce safety norms. And that will help drive the industry towards that direction that we're encouraging through this Value of Space Summit.
Yeah. Those are two great answers. I would just note, for me, I would note that my impression is that I think when people think about space, they instantly go to the ethereal, right? Space exploration, planets unexplored, phenomena unseen and unexplained. But the value of space is also very mundane, right? It's farmers fertilizing their crops, oceanographers studying the ocean, and getting to that hot new restaurant in the part of town that you're unfamiliar with. And these daily activities are a big part of the value of space that often go unrecognized. And that was really what kind of drove us to write the paper that we had last year. Okay, so after that short monologue, I would just congratulate both of you on putting together an impressive and ambitious event. Looking at the agenda, which I have in front of me, the summit covered space sustainability, safety norms and standards, activity in LEO, space insurance, everyday space, which is the subject that was kind of closest to what we addressed in our paper, space cyber, supply chain, among other issues. What session touched a development in space that you're most excited about? Erin, let's start with you.
I was really excited to hear about the ISO standards that are under development. We heard in our session that's on standards and norms that ISO is working on data message standards for orbits, conjunction data messaging, and space traffic coordination standards. So there was numerous amounts of commentary on ways to create norms in a community to gain consensus among people and generate this common understanding of how we move forward. But then it started to come out that we are actually doing this, and that there are bodies of groups that have already come together, public and private sector, to create specific standards, and they're soon to be published. So this is a little bit different than some of the other sessions where people said, yeah, there's some guidance that's out there, but there's not a lot to lean on. Like we have NIST 853, we have the space overlay, but there's not a lot that's required. But now we have a separate session that was talking about standards, and they are going to be publishing 3 separate sets. So I was very pleased to hear about this. And I think that that's kind of the direction that we're headed, is that as long as we work as a community, then we're going to keep producing more products like that.
Yeah, great. And Lori?
Yeah, so I think that it's fascinating that we're moving already to think about cislunar and beyond geo, and in particular cislunar enabling technologies like PNT. And when we were talking with the panel on that, and they were saying, well, what enabling capabilities would cislunar PNT support? And it's just a range of interesting capabilities, from rendezvous and docking to space domain awareness to entry, descent and landing, search and rescue on the moon. I thought that was fascinating. And then also just this idea of cloud and edge computing in space, where we are going to be able to bring analytics to the edge, closer to where the data needs to be analyzed, and doing sort of that AI ML, which is really fascinating. And then just the prospect of on-orbit manufacturing, definitely, by 2040. And, what does that mean? That just means a ton in terms of how we can innovate in space and, build structures and, adjust things as needed, fix GPS satellites. So that was really fascinating to me.
Yeah. Both great answers. One topic that that we haven't talked about yet is critical infrastructure, which I know is an important theme in the conference, and is actually a topic that Ed Swallow, one of our senior vice presidents at Aerospace, talked about in an interview this week. Can we play that clip?
One of the key national critical functions that I believe needs to be added goes along with a couple that already exist. There's one that's titled Delivering Passengers and Cargo by Truck. There's another one that says Delivering Passengers and Cargo by Air. There's another one, Delivering Passengers and Cargo by Ship. There isn't one about delivering passengers and cargo by spacecraft. Yet we're doing that today. Between the commercial resupply program, delivering cargo to the space station, the commercial crew program at NASA, delivering passengers to the space station, and now with Virgin Orbit, Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and SpaceX, delivering passengers, paying passengers, we really need to think about that as a critical function within the larger critical infrastructure establishment, so that we can get the right cyber controls in place to make sure that our ability to transit to, through, and from space is not degraded by cyber threats.
So for you two, which space technologies or systems do you think should be considered a critical infrastructure? And what would qualifying certain space systems or space technologies as critical infrastructure achieve? Why is this important? What are the two sides of this debate? Lori, let's start with you.
Sure. So as we heard on day one of the summit, maybe the first question isn't, what should be considered space critical infrastructure, but what do we want to do in space? What are those key activities and functions that we want to focus on? And then we can have the conversation about, what should be most secure, and prioritization, I think, is also critical. So that will be an activity that, DHS, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is currently looking at this. I think also whatever we're doing on the Earth and terrestrially, and it is designated critical infrastructure, if we have, lunar habitation or even, space stations, those will have to enable those living areas as well. So I think that there might be sort of a mirroring of, what we're doing with Earth in terms of how are we designating critical infrastructure. Also, to go a little bit beyond that, is when you think about the supply chain of these critical infrastructures, there's a lot that goes into developing a satellite or a John Deere tractor. And we need to think about some of the things that might not be considered critical infrastructure, things like commodities, like propellant fluid. So we need to think about technologies, and that might be the next iteration. So we started off with designating 16 critical infrastructure sectors. We started looking at the cross interdependencies of those, and then Homeland Security designated 55 national critical functions that were cross-cutting. And so now perhaps we devolve that a bit further and say, well, to support those national critical functions, what are the technologies, commodities, things along the supply chain that are important?
Thanks, Lori. Erin, same question to you. In particular, thinking about what are the technologies that might be good critical, might be pertinent for critical infrastructure designation or critical function designation, but also what that means in terms of protection. What Lori just talked about how DHS does this, but what does that mean? What is the effect?
Yeah, that's a good question that a lot of people are asking right now. And it was illuminated quite a few times in the Value of Space Summit. So I think that Ed Swallow's remarks are very pertinent in relation to what we're talking about as a global space community. There are different countries that are talking about how to set standards and how to set norms. But in addition to that, legislation that would protect space systems as critical infrastructure. So we've already seen some other countries adopt some legislation that does that. And in the US, we're having conversations, as Lori mentioned, led by DHS CISA, but some of these conversations started even before DHS CISA took the lead with the Science and Technology Partnership Forum that made the public announcement for the need for the Space ISAC. They started that discussion probably as early as 2017. And even before that, when there were discussions about a US Space Command and the need to protect the space domain. But if you evolve that conversation to the next iteration, then it becomes, well, it's not just about our national defense and protecting the space domain. It's also about the commercial and international dependencies that we have that have formed over time, and with the lower barriers to entry to get into the space economy, then we're going to have commercial sector companies that are producing services that we will depend on as humans on Earth. And that's actually already begun to happen. We heard conversations from Planet Inspire talking about their remote sensing capability, and several multinational corporations that exist that provide commercial telecom, and that's been around for a while. But what is not being addressed is the space system from the ground to space, the entire supply chain, and everything that goes into making all of the pieces and parts that go into space and go into those ground systems, and then the protection of the link. So when we think about space systems as a whole, then and protecting them and making them designated as critical infrastructure, then we're saying that so many national critical functions are using space. Just like so many of our national critical functions relate to transportation or relate to communications or relate to anything, that it bubbles up to a level that it needs to be established as its own critical infrastructure sector. So that means that we're not just looking at the defense industrial base, or I heard during our summit that there's now a term called space industrial base. And so it's not just the defense industrial base, it's not just the space industrial base, it is the entire global space economy. And what we've already created is an interdependency with the international corporations that we depend on. So we would be declaring space as systems as critical infrastructure so that they are included as well, not just our national defense industrial base.
Yeah, great. That's great. And that's super helpful. I get it. Prioritization of what's a critical infrastructure, and then that may guarantee or at least allows policymakers to think about those areas for further protection. I would also just note that Lori had speaking of the supply chain risk associated with the space industrial base, Lori had a really important report that came out last year. I encourage everyone to look at that. I want to ask a follow-on question about this commercial government nexus that you introduced, and this was covered in several sessions. We're witnessing dramatic changes in the commercial space sector. You brought up Erin, Spire, and Leo, and some of the changes with commercial Earth observation, remote sensing, and this is happening at a time when our national security and national civil space programs are also changing significantly. What to you, and let's start with Lori, what are the big opportunities here on the government side, and what are the big challenges? Lori, please.
Yeah, so I think that some of the most concerning things are also the biggest areas of opportunity. So when you think about what those things are that we need to take action critically on, that can provide us and move us forward, in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, really cooperation and coordination within the commercial sector, between commercial and government, between the US and international is really a long pole. We have to realize we can't do this alone. Commercial can't do it alone. They're relying on, government requirements to, be a buyer in this whole process to enable the space enterprise. The democratization of space is something that we're seeing, and commercial sector needs to understand, well, what does that mean for me, and how do I thrive and survive in this? It means a lot about the accelerating the economy. How can I do something more effectively and efficiently that will benefit others in the process? Also, the idea of being more transparent, having that visibility into data, information, threat intelligence, things like that, and enabling, and a lot of this is what Space ISAC is doing, enabling commercial to engage with the government and R&D centers, and encouraging that transparency is very important to overcome challenges so that we can move forward to the opportunities. I think also there was a lot of discussion at the summit about how do we develop norms and confidence building measures. How do we do that and not seem that we're trying to provoke another country, or that certain countries are adhering to a norm but others aren't. So it's like those who are in, those who are out. And also the area of the workforce. Are we ensuring that we have the right STEM graduates that we need? We had a panel that was looking at sort of the future of in 2060, and sort of what were the prognostications, or what were they thinking about that we would need? And it moves beyond, as we settle, in on the moon, or in space stations, we need to move beyond just thinking about how scientists and engineers are solutioning, but also include space attorneys and bioethicists and botanists and things like this. And so some of that we are trying to do. I think NASA's doing a lot of this, obviously, with human exploration, human space flight. But it is also something we need to be thinking about, and sort of imagining the future and having those opportunities, or just debating what those opportunities are 10, 20, 40 years from now is a very important exercise that the government just can't do, the commercial sector just can't do, but everyone needs to be in the room together.
So, Erin, about this commercial government nexus, what to you is the biggest opportunity for government, and what is the biggest challenge?
Well, Sam, I think there are loads of opportunity between government and commercial collaboration. And I know that this has existed for a long time. It's not new to the space community to do public-private partnership, but especially in the case of space, then I think we have to take it to another level. Because I heard some commentary during the Value of Space Summit during both day 1 and day 2, where folks made comments about a whole of nation or a whole of government approach. And I have no criticism for that, other than we also have to think whole of world approach, because every single state and every person is involved in space in some way, shape, or form. Either they're an end user, they're part of a nation state, or they are a citizen of a country that consumes space services, or they're a company that's actually doing business in space. So all of us have something to lose or to gain from public-private partnership that includes international collaboration. And without belaboring that point too much, then I'll just also give a few examples. So I heard, NASA has invested a significant amount of time building public-private partnerships and creating ways to access and tap the commercial sector. And also, the Department of Defense has done the same thing for a long time. I helped to launch the Air Force's Space Accelerator, and the whole premise behind that Space Accelerator is to gain access to new emerging commercial capabilities and transition them to the warfighter. So this is an ongoing effort, but now that we've entered almost like the next iteration where we can talk about threats and vulnerabilities, cybersecurity has become highly prevalent talk in our media, and we're all very well aware that we have infrastructure that's vulnerable because we created it, and nothing's perfect, right? So all of these threats and vulnerabilities are being talked about on several of them in a variety of different critical infrastructures in a public forum. So I would encourage that we use our public-private sector partnerships to enable more dialogue about threats and vulnerabilities to the space sector and to their different segments or elements of the supply chain that directly impact the space sector, so that we can address those on a global scale and we can have discussions about them and reduce our risk of attacks and incidents of compromise occurring that would affect every person across the globe.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. And I think that's right. Everybody needs to help each other. Otherwise, we're in a Hobbesian state of nature. Second political theory joke for the day. So, Lori, I now want to ask you, you and I had talked before recording this, that at the end of each panel, you were asking them to think about what to do next. What are the next steps? How can we actualize some of this discussion into a call to action? So what to you were the biggest calls to action from the summit? What are the biggest problems that the Value of Space Summit can help us navigate?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So I think there's a continuum of these biggest problems. Some we can solve in the near term, some are longer, but equally as critical. So on one of the panels, the last panel was talking about the future of space. How do we ensure, the future value of space? And one of the panelists said, this is going to be a really boring answer, but it really is about ensuring there's global regulations and global standards. Because currently, as things are, we have a lot of different countries who are doing different things. There's different norms in space that haven't even been made, regulations or standards. There are, even within the United States, we need to ensure that there are independent systems, and how do we ensure that there are interdependencies and interoperability among those systems? So thinking about that and how do we create the international partnerships, as Erin was saying, is critical, and we can do it. The next thing I think was fascinating. Planet Inspire were on a panel together, and they were complimenting one another on how they use data and work together with that data. So you can track with one set of data, you track a ship, that's beeping its AIS signal, and then when it stops, the other can use optics to pick up where it is. And so it's interesting that we will be able to, for reconnaissance and tracking, be able to leverage different sets of data. So that, I guess, the call to action is, how do commercial organizations, academic institutions that are doing scientific exploration and testing in space on the International Space Station, how are you leveraging the use of other data to create new capabilities or opportunities, and also to use that to bring in new market participants? So I think that was another one. And then a third was just sort of a lexicon discussion that we had about reframing the idea or the concept of what a target is. So usually we think of, a geo satcom, is a big juicy target in geo, and sort of an adversarial thought about the use of the word target. But if we sort of invert the concept and say, well, what are targets of opportunity? And now that is a common term, but how do we, if you think about orbital debris, so how do we target satellites that are end of life? How can we reuse them maybe for a different mission? How can we think about changing their mission, or sort of re-leveraging what they're doing in space? I think those are key areas.
Yeah, that was great. Erin, what about for you? What were some of the calls to action that resonated with you?
So I took away a lot of input from panelists that included conversation about creating opportunities for collaboration. And it came down to every single topic. Then there was always some reason why we need to ensure collaboration is taking place from a public and private sector point of view, international point of view. And one of the most striking comments was that we need to make space, into something that we all consider to be boring. And the reason why we would do that is because we have to think of it as like the evolution of the financial sector. We've been using currency for a very long time, and we made it boring on purpose so that we all had a common understanding of how things worked, just starting with trade and then evolving to digital currencies and electronic exchanges, and creating standards and common understanding for how we operate has taken a long time. And so with space, we're probably entering into the same realm, where if we want to really operate in a safe space, then we're going to introduce artificial intelligence and machine learning. And all of a sudden, people are not going to feel as safe because they don't understand it. But we have to talk about it enough and come up with a good mode of operations where we know what the best practices are and the norms for implementing AI/ML, say, in the ground station, as was mentioned during the Value of Space Summit. And if it's at the ground station level and we're doing cloud and data processing on a regular basis, then we have all reached a point ideally, we will have reached a point where we understand how it works, and that will take a while. But I'm truly optimistic that we can do it, and it's the right thing to do. And it seems that there are hundreds of other people who agree, because it was a topic of conversation in many of the panels.
Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna take that away from this conversation. Boring is cool, and yeah, that's great. Space should be boring. I think that's actually a really good way to put it. I not to be too self-promotional, but on this subject, I would just note that Jamie Moore and I had a paper out last year as part of our 2021 Space Agenda about how the federal government could leverage some of the commercial developments for national security space acquisition. And that's, if you're interested in this subject, feel free to look that up. So for my last question, what issues should the Value of Space Summit be focusing on next year? What was uncovered today that needs more attention, or what was addressed but just needs constant attention? Erin, let's start with you. And thank you both so much. This has been a really fun show for me. Over to you, Erin.
Okay, well, ironically enough, in the last session when we were talking about the future, that we had a couple of futurists, one from the Aerospace Corporation moderated, she did excellent. And it was mentioned that in 60 years from now, space systems better be designated as critical infrastructure. So I would say next year, we're going to be talking about that again. And what that means is that space systems is not falling under 16 other critical infrastructures. It's its own critical infrastructure sector. So, and that's a big takeaway from that portion of the event as well, because there was a whole panel dedicated to it. And there was a panelist on there who indicated that we should stop talking about this. We should just do it. And we need to take action now, expend our resources on protecting our assets, and stop discussing whether or not we have critical infrastructure on our hands or not. And so I think that ultimately we will be working towards that. And in order to work towards that and create that alignment of all the different agencies that have a hand in space, which according to my records, it's over 18 different US government agencies that have space as part of their mission. We're going to have to include a lot of them in our discussions. So I would anticipate that this event will continue to grow, include more public sector partners, and include even more international corporations as part of this discussion. And we'll keep moving on the topics of information sharing, sharing of threat intelligence, and norms and standards.
Great, thank you, Erin. And Lori, what should we be thinking about next year at the 2022 Value of Space Summit?
Yeah, so I think between now and then, we will have a lot of the folks who were, I think there were about 400 folks who participated in the two-day session this year in 2021. And I think most of those people were technologists, and it was fascinating to hear the comments, the discussion, the questions. A lot of them were focused on policy issues, norms, international issues, and then also, economics. So I'm very curious to see how some of the calls to action that weren't even technology focused, those technologists that, were asking those questions, how they'll work or think about policy issues and information sharing, and the value proposition of how they will move into a new market. I'm kind of curious to see how we'll have a different sort of a shift, maybe from a lot of thinking about technology and their daily life to other aspects of that technology, policy, and economy, sort of the triumvirate. And that's critical because they're all important to move forward. They're all interdependent. And I think that's critically important. So always, for an R&D center, there's a lot of scientists and engineers, but also have to have or enabling policy to be influenced by sound, rigorous technology and insight and innovation. So hopefully we'll have more of that link And then we'll be able to see that next year.
Great, thanks. And Lori, it's so great to see you again.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate the opportunity. It was great talking with Erin for the last, was it 48 hours? Thank you.
Sorry. And Erin, so nice to meet you virtually. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. It's been great being on here. And Lori, I've loved working with you as well.
Okay, with that, I'd encourage everyone to watch out for the 2022 Value of Space Summit next year. Thanks.
Thank you to Erin, Lori, and Sam. They've given us a lot to think about when it comes to securing space as a critical infrastructure. And thank you to our outstanding production team, Colleen Stover, James Liggins, and Jordan Bingham. Check us out on Twitter using hashtag The Space Policy Show. Sign up for our latest news and alerts at aerospace.org/policy, and be sure to look for our podcasts and share your favorite episodes with colleagues. We look forward to having you tune in to the next episode of The Space Policy Show, and until then, take care.